Over 100 years ago, the Federal Reserve was passed by Congress and signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. The goal of the Federal Reserve was to, number one, make sure that the business cycle would be much smoother than it was the 20 years previous that. And just because they thought this business cycle would be much better, there were some consequences that occurred 100 years later. That included the depreciation of the dollar over 97%, having two incomes now raising a family rather than one, just like it was in 1913. And the list goes on and on and on. The buildup of the warfare/welfare state. So this is what the Federal Reserve has done, and you have many pom-pom supporters or cheerleaders of the Federal Reserve that fail to acknowledge this fact. And it's unfortunate that we get fed all these lies through the mainstream media. Let's look at one book, and it's called The Federal Reserve History, or History of the Federal Reserve by Alan Meltzer. And we should look at why the Federal Reserve was created based on his historical research, or his research. In 1913, the London market financed most United States exports. Since the exports included mainly agricultural products, there was a large seasonal demand for financing in the fall, so interest rates rose each fall. U.S. bankers wanted to replace London bankers. They believed that they were at a disadvantage, since they could not discount export credits at a central bank. Politicians wanted to reduce the seasonal fluctuation in interest rates. A bank that could expand credit and reduce interest rates seasonally satisfied both groups. Seasonal credit expansion was not the only reason for establishing the Federal Reserve. Recessions in 1983 or 1893, 94, and this goes on, averaged 19 months according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. In all, there were 113 months of recessions from December 1895 to January 1912, 55% of the time. Several of the recessions were severe. Financial panics, interest rates temporarily at an annual rate of 100% or more. Financial failures and bankruptcies were much too frequent. Other countries had a lender of last resort to ameliorate financial crises or even prevent them. The series of crises and financial panics increased support for creation of a new institution. So, let's get this straight. The first paragraph talks about a reason that the alternative media does not talk about why the Federal Reserve was created. We were always told that there were powerful families behind the creation of the Federal Reserve in order to expand the warfare/welfare state. No doubt we have an expanded warfare/welfare state, but one reason that, or one explanation of the Federal Reserve is never explained by the alternative media, and it's here. It's that New York bankers wanted a piece of the pie that the London bankers had. London bankers finance U.S. exports, and that's one thing that's never talked about. Although I agree with the alternative media that because the Federal Reserve was created, you do have a warfare/welfare state. Let's look at some of the reasons how the Federal Reserve has, number one, expanded our currency, or has created an elastic currency by spending all this money on the warfare state and the welfare state. Now let's look at this. How the Fed helped pay for World War I. It's by John Paul Koenig of the Mises Institute, or Mises.org. Let's go all the way down let's go all the way down. Just as kings debased to help pay for their wars, the Federal Reserve used inflation to help pay for U.S. participation in World War I. It did so by creating and issuing dollars in returns for government debt. In effect, the Fed's balance sheet became a repository for war bonds. Furthermore, the Fed brought this debt onto its balance sheet at a higher price than the market would have paid otherwise, a subsidy borne by all those who held money as its purchasing power declined. Let's scroll down over here and let's look at a few paragraphs. Okay. With the United States gearing up for the war, President Woodrow Wilson announced in April 1917 the first war bond issues, or Liberty Bond drives, to help prop up the war bond market. Another market was made to the act to further pry open the Fed's balance sheet to the acceptance of government debt. Section 13.8 loans were now permitted to serve along with real bills and gold as eligible backing assets for Federal Reserve notes. and then it just goes on and on and on. And then let's just look at a graph of how central banks funded war, and we could see there were more purchases of bonds during that time. The Federal Reserve balance sheet grew, and this financed World War One. And it's quite ironic that the left in this country, progressives, always pom-pom and cheerlead the Federal Reserve, but are anti-war. But if they're supporting the Federal Reserve, they are in fact supporting the warfare state. As crazy as that sounds. And this is what you'll never hear from a guy like Paul Krugman. Okay, let's go back to Alan Meltzer's book. And in this, he talks about the Federal Reserve, how they financed World War II. Let's just read an excerpt. In the first half of the 1940s, the Federal Reserve helped to finance World War II by purchasing government securities at fixed rates. It continued this policy after the war ended. So there you go. You have a professor who's not a conspiracy theorist admitting that the Federal Reserve financed the war, financed World War II. Something you'll never hear coming from the Huffington Post, or once again Paul Krugman, or Matthew Iglesias, a protege of Krugman, or a Joe Wiesenthal. He actually was doing a debate with Meath, or what's his name, Meath Shedlock, on Russia Today with Lauren Lister when she was on there. And Joe Wiesenthal said it in this interview that the Federal Reserve does not finance war. He's clearly wrong. And that's something that, once again, progressives never admit. And this is how the Federal Reserve finances wars, by keeping interest rates way below the market rate and thus allowing an increase in money supply and allowing the government to spend more than they otherwise would have if you had a true free market. Now, we have to look at how the United States has had a larger welfare spending spree than they otherwise could have. And we have to look at what actually went in through the thought process of FDR's admin. And this is part of Ann Coulter's book. I'm reading this off of the Economic Policy Journal, which is by Robert Wenzel. It was all about LBJ's crazed Great Society program, Coulter continues. Everyone knew, even FDR's Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, knew that granting widows' benefits to unmarried women with illegitimate children would have disastrous consequences. But under LBJ, that's exactly the system liberals implemented. The suitable home requirements, such as having a husband, were jettisoned as irrational and racist by liberal know-it-alls in the Federal Bureau of Public Assistance. By 1960, only 8% of welfare benefits intended for widows or wives with disabled husbands were being collected by such. More than 60% of aids to families with dependent children payments went to absent father homes. As a result, illegitimacy, particularly among blacks, went through the roof. That was the year the black marriage rate began its precipitous decline, gradually at first, with the marriage rate for black women falling below 70% for the first time only in 1970. By 2010, only 30.1% of blacks above the age of 15 were married, compared to 52.7% of whites. To hide their own role in the suppression of a black middle class, liberals promoted the myth that slavery alone had produced dystopian black lives. This is the quasi-theological underpinning of the modern welfare state. And this is quite interesting because whenever you have a Federal Reserve system, you can spend more than you otherwise could have. And this LBJ situation actually happened during the Great Society program, happened in the late 1960s. Which was the Great Society program. And during this time, we were coming off the gold exchange standard that was set during Bretton Woods' reign in 1944. That eventually broke down. There was obviously the London Gold Pool. That broke down. This goes on and on. And because of all this welfare spending, we got off, and military spending, we got off the gold exchange standard. In addition to that, because we had a Federal Reserve System, the United States was able to have this Great Society program, which actually created more illegitimacy. This is what guys like Krugman will never admit. And if you ever talk about this, a lot of people who bring this topic up, regardless of what race you're talking about, whether it's illegitimacy in black communities or white communities, Hispanic communities, whatever. The thing is, if you bring this up, the automatic thing that they're going to say is you're racist, right? If you bring up anything about illegitimacy. And this is the sad part. Doesn't matter what race it is. Just because, or when you had LBJ implement the system, well, it was only allowed because of a Federal Reserve System, because the government could spend more than they otherwise could have. And we got off the gold exchange standard as well. And this is what people don't understand. When you don't have a gold standard, and when you have a Federal Reserve, you could spend a lot more on goodies that you couldn't have in the past. And this is why you have maniacs such as Nancy Pelosi telling the American people, well, you gotta pass the healthcare bill in order to see what's in it. And because of that, we have the disaster called Obamacare. So this is the product of the welfare and warfare state, and it's only created by the Federal Reserve System. And this is really important to know on the 100-year anniversary of the Federal Reserve. So if you want to know what's wrong and you're new to economics, well, it's the Fed. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll talk to you another time.